The final swing of the heavy oak door was not a slam, but a soft, dull thud. It was a sound of finality, more profound than any shout. Ilara stood on the porch, the worn plank suddenly alien beneath her boots, and watched as the bolt slid home on the other side. That sound, a simple scrape of iron in its housing, was the end of her life in the town of Providence Creek. Her uncle, Silas, a man whose hands were as hard and unyielding as the iron he forged, had made his decision. He stood behind the wavy glass of the window, his face a mask of grim duty. He had read the will that morning in the cold parlor, the air still thick with the scent of pine from her father's coffin. The house, the smithy, the small accounts, all were to be liquidated to cover debts her father had apparently accrued, debts no one had ever spoken of. Silas's voice had been flat, a recitation of facts that left no room for grief or argument. When he was done, he had pressed a small worn leather pouch into her hand. $20, Ilara. It is what remains. His gaze did not meet hers. And the deed to the marsh plot, your father's folly. It is worthless, but it is in your name. She looked down at the pouch in her palm, its weight a mockery of the life that had been taken from her. $20. And a piece of paper describing a tract of useless, soggy land 2 miles north of town, a place children were warned away from, a place good for nothing but mosquitoes and mud. It was where her father, a man who saw patterns in bird flight and wisdom in the bend of a willow branch, had spent his last years sketching reeds and studying the composition of mud. The town had called him an eccentric. Now Silas called his legacy a folly. At her side, a low whine escaped the throat of Cinder, her father's old hound. The dog, a grizzled mix of gray and black with one clouded eye, pushed his head against her hand, his body a solid, warm anchor in a world that had just dissolved. She had nothing left but a handful of coins, a worthless deed, the clothes on her back, and this sad, loyal dog. She was 19 years old. The murmurs of the town were already beginning. From the steps of the Mercantile across the dusty street, Mr. Gable watched, polishing a glass jar with a rag, his expression one of pursed-lip pity. He was a man who measured the world in profit and loss, and he had just seen Ilara move decisively into the loss column. A few women, coming from the well, stopped and whispered behind their hands, their eyes flicking toward her, then away. They saw a charity case, an orphan to be taken in, a problem to be solved with a place as a scullery maid or a hasty, loveless marriage. Silas's wife, her Aunt May, had offered her a cot in the attic. "You can help with the mending," she'd said, her voice thin and strained, as if the very offer cost her something vital. It is the Christian thing to do. The offer was a cage, a life of quiet servitude under the roof of the man who had just dispossessed her. Ilara felt a cold, hard knot form in her gut. It was not grief. It was something else, something harder. It was resolve. She turned her back on the house she was born in, the thud of the door still echoing in her ears. With Cinder trotting at her heel, she walked directly to Gable's Mercantile. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful, hollow sound. Mr. Gable stopped his polishing. "A tragedy, Ilara, a true tragedy," he said, his voice oozing a practiced sympathy. "If you need anything on account until you find a place—" "I have money," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She untied the pouch and laid the coins on the worn wooden counter. "I need a good axe, a sack of flour, salt, a side of bacon, and a cast-iron pot." Gable raised an eyebrow. He looked from the coins to her face, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. This was not the shopping list of a desperate girl seeking charity. This was the list of someone preparing for a long winter. "An axe? That's a man's tool, Ilara." "My father taught me how to use one," she replied, her gaze steady, "and a sharp knife, and a small sack of nails." He weighed her order, his mind clearly tallying the cost. "That will be most of what you have there, are you sure? A ticket on the eastbound stage would be a wiser purchase. There are cities, opportunities for a young woman. "This is what I need," she said. He shrugged, the gesture washing his hands of her foolishness. He gathered the items, his movements slow and deliberate, as if giving her time to change her mind. He wrapped the bacon in brown paper, weighed out the salt, and selected an axe with a solid hickory handle. As he counted out her change, a few remaining pennies, he gave his final piece of advice. "That marshland is a fool's inheritance, child. It will swallow you whole. Sell the deed for $1 to the first man who'll take it, and don't look back." Ilara took the supplies, packing them into a rough burlap sack. She hefted the axe, its weight familiar and comforting in her hand. She did not reply. She simply turned, pushed the door open, and walked out into the street, the cheerful bell mocking her departure. She did not look back at her uncle's house, or at the whispering women, or at the town that had already written her off. With the heavy sack on her shoulder and the dog at her side, she walked north toward the swamp, toward her father's folly. The journey was a descent. The well-worn track leading out of Providence Creek slowly dissolved into a pair of muddy ruts, then a faint trail, and finally nothing but damp, yielding earth. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of wet soil and decay. Tall, skeletal trees draped in moss loomed on either side, their branches clawing at the gray sky. Cinder walked closer to her now, his tail low, sniffing the air with a nervous energy. Every step was a battle against the sucking mud that tried to pull the boots from her feet. The weight of the sack dug into her shoulder, a constant burning reminder of the sum total of her worldly possessions. After 2 hours of punishing travel, she saw it. Just as the townspeople had described, it was a vast, flat expanse of murky water and sawgrass, punctuated by the ugly, gray lump of a rock hillock rising from the center like a rotten tooth. A steady, cold drizzle began to fall, turning the world into a smear of gray and brown. This was her inheritance, a wasteland. She stood at the edge of the marsh, the cold rain seeping into her collar, and a wave of despair so profound it made her knees weak washed over her. The town was right. Her uncle was right. This place was worthless. It was a grave. The hard knot of resolve in her stomach loosened, replaced by a hollow, aching emptiness. She had been so determined, so defiant, but the reality of this place was a crushing weight. What could possibly be built here? What could possibly live here but misery? Cinder whined again, sensing her despair, and nudged her hand, his wet nose cold against her skin. For a long moment she considered turning back, walking into town, and begging for that cot in her aunt's attic. But the memory of that closing door, of her uncle's cold eyes, stopped her. Pride was a poor substitute for a warm bed, but it was all she had left. Clenching her jaw, she pushed forward, her boots sinking into the muck. She had to see the whole of it. She had to stand on her land, even if it was sinking beneath her feet. She made her way to the rock hillock, the only solid ground in the entire soggy plot. It was a jumble of granite and fractured shale, slick with rain and moss. She circled its base, looking for any feature, any small advantage. Most of it was exposed, battered by the wind that swept across the flat marsh. But on the north side, tucked away from the prevailing wind, she found it. It was not a cave, not really. It was a deep fissure, a crack in the heart of the rock, about 10 feet wide at the mouth and narrowing as it went back perhaps 20 feet. The ground inside was not mud, but damp, packed earth and gravel, and it was mostly dry, sheltered from the rain by a thick overhang of granite. She stepped inside, the air immediately still and quiet. The sound of the wind died away, replaced by a profound silence. Parrub. She ran her hand along the rock wall. It was cold and damp to the touch, as expected. But as she moved deeper into the fissure, she felt something strange, a subtle shift in the air. She placed her palm flat against the back wall, deep within the crevice. It was not warm, not like a hearth, but it lacked the biting chill of the exterior rock. It held a faint, deep, residual coolness that was somehow less hostile than the air outside. It was thermal mass. Her father had spoken of it, how the earth itself holds a steady temperature, resisting the extremes of the seasons. This rock was a natural barrier against the freezing winters and scorching summers. Then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound. Drip, drip, drip. In a small alcove near the back of the fissure, a tiny, steady stream of water seeped from a crack in the granite, falling into a small, perfectly clear pool below. She knelt and touched the water. It was icy cold and pure. A year-round spring, protected from the filth of the marsh, flowing from the heart of the stone. She stood up, her heart pounding. Water, shelter from the wind, thermal stability. She looked out from the mouth of the fissure, across the expanse of the marsh. The town saw a swamp. Her father had seen something else. And now, so did she. Her gaze fell upon the endless sea of tall, thick reeds growing in the shallows. They were a nuisance, an obstacle. But she remembered her father sitting at his desk, sketching their hollow stalks. "Nature's finest insulation, Ilara," he had told her, his voice full of quiet wonder. "Each stalk is a column of trapped air, a million tiny pockets of stillness. That's the secret to warmth, stillness. Stone for walls, water to drink, reeds for a roof." The despair that had gripped her moments before was burned away by a surge of fierce, desperate hope. The town was wrong. This land wasn't worthless. It was waiting. The work began at dawn the next day. The first task was to fell the small, spindly trees that grew near the fissure, clearing a space to build. The axe her father had taught her to use felt like an extension of her own arm. She learned the rhythm of it, the deep bite into the wood, the spray of chips, the satisfying groan as a tree gave way. The labor was brutal. Within hours her hands were raw, blisters forming and breaking on her palms, leaving angry red patches that stung with every movement. By evening her muscles screamed with a fire she had never known, an exhaustion so deep it felt like a kind of numbness. She collapsed inside the fissure, Cinder curled beside her for warmth, and slept the sleep of the dead. Day after day the routine was the same. Chop, haul, stack. She used the logs to frame out a front wall for the fissure, enclosing the space and turning it from a rock crevice into a room. The largest challenge was stone. She needed to build a solid wall, one that would stand against the wind and the winter. The hillock was made of granite and shale, and she discovered that by finding cracks in the shale and driving wooden wedges into them, she could split off large flat pieces. It was slow, painstaking work. She would hammer a wedge, move to the next, and return over and over until a deep groan signaled the rock was giving way. Then came the back-breaking labor of moving the stones, some so heavy she could only roll them an inch at a time, her body straining with every ounce of her strength. She learned to make mortar from the thick clay at the marsh's edge, mixing it with dried grass and water to form a thick, sticky paste. She packed it between the stones, sealing the gaps against the wind. Her wall rose slowly, a crooked but solid barrier of gray stone and dark mud. She left openings for a door and a small window. Each completed course of stone was a victory, a tangible line drawn against the wilderness. While the wall took shape, she began work on her other systems. She dug out the small pool where the spring collected, deepening it and lining the bottom and sides with a thick layer of clay, creating a small, clean cistern that would hold 12 gallons of water inside her home. For a fireplace, she used a natural indentation in the back wall of the fissure. She carefully widened a thin crack that led upwards through the rock, creating a crude but effective chimney that would draw the smoke up and away. The massive stone wall itself would serve as a heat sink, absorbing the fire's warmth during the day and radiating it back through the long, cold nights. The roof was the most ambitious part of her plan. Using the logs she had cut, she built a sturdy, angled frame that sloped from the top of her new stone wall to the rock face above the fisher's entrance. Then she began the harvest. For weeks she waded into the cold marsh water, cutting armful after armful of the thick, tall reeds with her knife. She laid them out on the rock to dry in the autumn sun, turning them daily. The pile grew into a small mountain of hollow, golden stalks. When they were fully dry, she began the thatching. She tied the reeds into tight bundles, called bolts, and started at the bottom of the roof frame, laying them in overlapping layers. She packed them so densely that they formed a solid mass, nearly 2 feet thick. It was slow, repetitive work, her fingers growing numb as she tied bundle after bundle into place. It was her father's foolish theory made real. This thick blanket of trapped air would be her defense against the cold. By the time the first frost silvered the marsh grass, she had a home, a single, small room, half stone-built, half natural rock, with a dirt floor and a thick, strange-looking roof of reeds. It was crude, but it was hers. She had built it with her own 2 hands. But her supplies were dwindling. The flour was nearly gone, the bacon a memory. She needed more than just a shelter. She needed a way to survive the winter. With a deep breath, she knew she had to go back to Providence Creek. Her return to town caused a small stir. She was thinner, her face weathered by sun and wind, her hands calloused and scarred. Her clothes were stained with mud and pine pitch. She was no longer the blacksmith's pitiable niece. She was something wilder, something the town did not understand. At Gable's Mercantile, the whispers stopped as she entered. Mr. Gable looked her up and down, a smug, knowing look on his face. "Come back for that ticket east, have you, girl?" he asked, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "I told you that swamp was no place to live." "I need supplies," she said, ignoring his jibe. She counted out the last of her money. "A sack of seed potatoes, a few chickens if you have any, and a piglet." A ripple of snickering went through the few customers in the store. A piglet? For the girl living in a mud puddle? Gable laughed out loud. "A piglet? Child, you'll be lucky to feed yourself through the winter, let alone livestock. Where do you plan on keeping them in that rock crack with you?" "That is my concern," Elara said, her voice low and even. Her quiet dignity seemed to infuriate him more than any angry retort would have. He sold her the goods grudgingly, taking the last of her coins. The sight of Elara walking out of town, a crate of clucking chickens under one arm and a squealing piglet on a rope lead, became the new favorite story in Providence Creek. She was not just a fool. She was a spectacle. Back at her homestead, she built a small 3-sided lean-to for the animals against the side of the hillock, using leftover stones and logs. It was sheltered from the wind and shared a wall with her own home, their small bodies adding a minuscule amount of warmth. Cinder, who had been her only companion, seemed to accept the new arrivals with a weary sigh. The dog was her shadow, her guard, her silent confidant. In the crushing loneliness of the marsh, his steady presence was the only thing that kept her sane. He would lie by the fire, his head on his paws, watching her every move, a constant living reminder that she was not entirely alone in the world. As autumn bled into winter, the town's mockery solidified into a nickname. They called her the Marsh Witch, a strange creature living in a swamp with a roof made of weeds. The name was whispered after church and spoken aloud in the tavern. It was a way of dismissing her, of turning her strange survival into a dark fairy tale. One afternoon, a man named Brant, a trapper known for his woodcraft and his arrogance, rode his horse to the edge of her clearing. He was the embodiment of the town's practical, rugged wisdom. He sat on his horse, looking at her small, strange home, and a slow, contemptuous smile spread across his face. "That's your roof?" he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. He pointed a leather-gloved finger at the thick layer of reeds. "That thing will soak through rot and collapse on your head in the first real snow. You're building your own tomb, girl." Elara was mending the small fence for her chickens and did not look up. "It will hold," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Brant laughed, a harsh barking sound. "You listen to me. I've lived in these mountains my whole life. I know what winter does. That roof is a fool's dream." He spat on the ground, wheeled his horse around, and rode off, still chuckling. His words were meant to be a warning, but they felt like a curse. The first snows came, light and feathery. The reed roof, to her relief, shed the powder easily. A heavier, wetter snow followed, and she watched with a knot of anxiety in her stomach as it piled up. The weight made the log frame groan, but it held. Brant's prediction echoed in her mind, a seed of doubt. But the reeds, tightly packed and layered, did not seem to absorb the moisture. The water ran off the oily outer layers, and the snow sat on top, adding another layer of insulation. Her life settled into a deep, solitary rhythm dictated by the cold and the light. She woke before dawn, the air in the stone room chilled, but never truly freezing. Her first task was always the fire. A bed of coals was carefully preserved overnight, and with dry kindling she would bring it back to life. The flickering light pushed back the shadows, and the growing warmth was a daily miracle. She would check on her animals, breaking the ice in their water trough and giving them their small ration of feed. The chickens provided an egg every day or two, a precious source of protein. The piglet grew fat on scraps and roots she dug from the frozen ground. Her world was small, but it was complete. The fire for heat, the cistern for water, the animals and her snares for food, the rock for shelter. The routine was her shield against the vast, empty loneliness of the wilderness. Cinder was her only conversation, his soft snores the only other sound in the deep silence of the winter nights. The town of Providence Creek, with its mockery and its pity, felt a world away. She was the sovereign of her small, stone kingdom. Then came the ice. It did not start as a storm, but as a cold, persistent rain falling from a slate-gray sky. The temperature dropped steadily, and as the rain fell, it froze instantly on contact with every surface. The world was being encased in glass. Tree branches, coated in ice, grew thicker and heavier by the hour. The delicate reeds of the marsh became crystal spears. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. For 2 days the freezing rain fell. The world outside her small window became an alien landscape of shimmering, deadly weight. The groaning began on the second night. Not the familiar groans of her roof settling, but sharp cracking sounds that echoed across the frozen marsh like gunshots. It was the sound of the forest breaking. In Providence Creek, the ice storm was a catastrophe. The weight was too much for conventional structures. Massive limbs from the ancient oaks that lined the town square snapped and fell like guillotines, crashing through the roofs of the town hall and the church. Mr. Gable's mercantile, his pride and joy, suffered a cracked roof beam. Shingles, frozen brittle, split and shattered under the immense load, allowing icy water to drip down onto his precious stock. Silas, the blacksmith, a man who built things to last, heard a sound like thunder and ran into his kitchen to find a massive oak branch had obliterated his table and shattered the cast-iron stove. The town's confidence, built on solid wood and sensible design, was shattered. Doors were frozen shut, windows sealed, with a thick layer of impenetrable ice. Worst of all, the wood piles were useless. Every log, every piece of kindling, was entombed in a glassy shell that no axe could break. Families huddled together in the cold, their fires dying, listening to their own homes crack and groan around them. The town that had prided itself on its resilience was being broken by the cold. Inside her stone shelter, Elara was an island of calm in a world of chaos. Her home was untouched. The granite hillock was impervious to the ice. Her low, solid stone walls bore the weight without a tremor, and the roof, the subject of so much scorn, performed its quiet miracle. The thick, flexible mat of reeds bent under the load. The ice formed a heavy shell on top, but it did not crack the structure. The millions of tiny air pockets in the hollow stalks acted as a perfect insulator, preventing the deep, penetrating cold from reaching the interior. The ice was a burden, but it could not break what was designed to flex. The fire in her hearth burned steadily, its warmth absorbed by the massive stone wall behind it, which radiated a gentle, constant heat into the small room. Her animals were safe and calm in their lean-to, sheltered by the same unyielding rock. Her cistern provided clean, unfrozen water. She sat by the fire, mending a sock with Cinder asleep at her feet, listening to the world break outside. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach. The banging on her door came on the third day. It was a frantic, desperate sound, muffled by the ice. Cinder leaped to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elara picked up the heavy poker from the hearth and moved cautiously to the door. It took all her strength to shove it open against the ice that had built up around the frame. A figure stumbled and fell across her threshold, a ghost of snow and ice. She dragged him inside, away from the biting wind, and pushed the door shut. As she brushed the ice from his face, she recognized him. It was Brant, the trapper, the man who had laughed at her. His face was a waxy, dead white, his lips blue. His clothes were stiff with ice. He was half frozen, his words coming in shuddering gasps. My cabin, a tree, roof came down. He looked at her, his arrogant eyes now wide with a mixture of pain and disbelief. I followed the smoke. I thought my mind was playing tricks. No fire should be burning. Elara looked at the man who had called her a fool, who had mocked the very home that was now his only hope of survival. A bitter, cold satisfaction flickered within her. He was wrong. They were all wrong. But the sight of his chattering teeth and the dead white patches of frostbite on his hands extinguished the feeling as quickly as it had come. He was a human being, and he was dying on her floor. Her choice was no choice at all. She said nothing of his mockery. She simply went to work. She cut away his frozen coat with her sharp knife and pulled off his boots. She wrapped him in the warmest blankets she had and sat him before the fire, forcing him to drink hot, salty broth she ladled from the pot. It was a slow, painful process. As feeling returned to his hands and feet, he moaned in agony, but it was the pain of life, not death. He was the first. Later that day, another figure appeared, a boy of about 15, shivering violently, his face streaked with tears. It was Silas's son Thomas. "Father sent me," the boy stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Our roof is gone. Mother is sick with the cold. We have no dry wood. We saw the smoke." Elara felt a different kind of pang, this one sharper. Silas, the man who had cast her out, now sending his son to beg for help. She looked at the boy, his youth and terror plain on his face. She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She gave the boy a warm blanket and a bowl of broth, seating him next to the trapper who was now sleeping fitfully by the fire. She took a sled she had built from saplings, loaded it with as much dry split wood as it could carry, and sent the boy back to his family with it. She was rationing her own survival to save the family of the man who had left her with nothing. As Brant slowly recovered, his eyes began to take in the details of the small room. He stared in stunned silence. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and roasting potatoes. A handful of chickens clucked softly in their corner pen. The piglet was nestled in a bed of clean, dry straw. On a small shelf near the hearth, a box of herbs showed defiant green shoots growing in the dim light. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the stone wall behind the fireplace. It was deeply, wonderfully warm. "How?" he finally whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. He looked up at the ceiling, at the tightly packed reeds, perfectly dry and intact. The roof, it should have cracked. It's just grass. It's not grass, Alara said quietly, stirring the stew on the fire. The stems are hollow. They trap the air. It flexes. It doesn't break. Brant stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the simple, profound truth with a lifetime of certainty. He, the expert woodsman, had been wrong. This young woman, this marsh witch, had understood the winter in a way he never had. The ice storm broke on the fourth day. The rain stopped, and a weak, watery sun appeared, its light fracturing into a million dazzling points off the ice-coated world. The danger had passed, but the devastation remained. That afternoon, another visitor came. It was Silas. He stood in the doorway, a man humbled. His face was gray with exhaustion and worry. He saw Brant alive and recovering. He saw his own son, Thomas, who had returned to the shelter, knowing it was the warmest place for miles. His gaze swept the room, taking in the same details that had stunned the trapper. The warmth, the food, the calm, the impossible, life-giving order of it all. He looked at the roof, the walls, and finally at Alara. She was no longer the lost girl he had sent into the wilderness. She stood before him, her face calm, her hands steady, the undisputed master of this small, warm world she had built from nothing. The proud blacksmith, the pillar of the community, stood in the entrance of her folly, and his shoulders slumped in defeat. "We were wrong, Alara," he said, his voice thick with a shame that was deeper than the cold. "We called you a fool. My God," he breathed, shaking his head slowly. "We were the fools." This was the moment of her triumph, the words she had longed to hear. But looking at her uncle, a broken man seeking warmth, she felt no desire for vengeance, no need to gloat. Her victory was not in his admission, but in the crackling fire, the warm walls, the life she had preserved. She simply nodded and gestured with the ladle toward the pot. "There is stew," she said. "Eat before you go back." In the days that followed the great ice storm of '83, the community of Providence Creek was transformed. The story of what happened spread from house to house, the story of the town's failing structures, and of the one home that had stood unshaken. People began to make the difficult journey out to the marsh, not with pity or curiosity, but with a new, profound respect. They came to trade. A family whose milk cow had survived brought her a pail of fresh milk in exchange for a basket of dry firewood. Mr. Gable, his mercantile in shambles, came himself, offering her any tool in his store in exchange for a share of her butchered pig. He did not meet her eye. The nickname Marsh Witch died on their lips, replaced with hushed, respectful titles. The Reed House, some called it, or simply Ilara's place. Silas returned a week later. He did not speak. He simply laid a set of new, finely crafted tools at her door, a sharp saw, a perfectly balanced hammer, and a set of chisels, their steel gleaming. It was the only apology he knew how to make. She accepted them with a quiet nod. That spring, as the town began to rebuild, a new wisdom took hold. Several families, their homes destroyed, came to Alara not for charity, but for knowledge. They asked her to show them how to harvest the reeds, how to bundle them, how to build a roof that would flex instead of break. They learned to dig clay from the edge of the marsh for mortar, and to build with the unyielding stone of the earth. Her father's folly became the new blueprint for survival in Providence Creek. The landscape of the town began to change, the sharp, vulnerable angles of shingled roofs slowly being replaced by the soft, thick, resilient curves of thatch. Years passed. Ilara's home grew. She added another room, built of the same stone and clay. She cleared more land, creating a thriving garden in raised beds that sat above the marshy ground. Her livestock multiplied. The once desolate plot became a small, self-sufficient homestead, an oasis of ingenuity in a place no one had wanted. Her story became a local legend, a tale told to children on long winter nights, a reminder that true strength often lies in what is quiet, what is flexible, what is overlooked. She stood outside her home one autumn evening, watching the sun set over the marsh, painting the reeds in hues of gold and fire. A young dog, a descendant of Cinder, lay at her feet. She was no longer the girl who had been cast out, but a woman who had built her world from the ground up. She had faced injustice, despair, and the scorn of her community, and had answered it all not with words, but with labor, with wisdom, and with grace. She had built more than a shelter against the storm. On the land that everyone called worthless, using the knowledge that everyone called foolish, she had built a life.